So ethics by design has recently become a much talked about topic. It's a concept supported by the European Commission. They want ethics by design to be part of their new Horizon Europe program, but it's also very popular with professional organizations like the IEEE, the Engineering Foundation for Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and for many scholars. So in the SIENNA project on ethics of emerging technologies, we have a big focus on AI and big data, and we have developed an ethics by design approach. And there are not many such approaches currently existing for AI. There's one more that is currently being developed actually by IEEE. But I'm going to tell you today, of course, about the one we developed in the SIENNA project. Okay, so what's the central idea with ethics by design? The central idea is that in the development of technology, our design choices can have systematic positive or negative effects for the moral values that we hold dear. So this is not an immediately obvious idea. Many people think, well, technology is basically neutral. It's how you use it which determines its moral positive or negative effects, right? So it's not a hammer that kills people. It's how you use the hammer, whether you use it to create a beautiful piece of furniture or whether you kill someone. But in fact, research has shown that there are, for more complex devices than a hammer, like software and computer systems, there are actually systemic effects that relate to our values. For example, privacy. We know that some software designs protect privacy, others harm it, right? It all depends on whether or not the transfer of personal information is being supported or not by the device, and whether or not you can control that. Or another example would be sustainability. Some designs contribute more to sustainability than others. Then I'm of course not talking about so much about software or computer systems. I'm talking about other products. Some towards sustainability, they are sustainable, biodegradable, for example. Others are not. They emit carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, so ethics by design requires you to believe this idea that our values can be either systematically supported by our design choices or harmed by them. So how can you do ethics by design if you want to do it? Well, there's several steps in order. First, we need to know what moral values and principles you want to support. So you need some kind of moral guidance and an ethical guidance framework. Secondly, you need to know what the existing design approaches look like. That is, you cannot do some abstract approach that disregards current design methodology. You have to actually piggyback on existing approaches and integrate your ethics by design approach into them. And third, you then want to operationalize those moral values and principles that you have identified within those existing approaches. So that's what we have set out to do in the SIENNA project. So how can you actually operationalize values? I'm going to give you a simple example of that, which is the design of a chicken coop. And the idea is that you do this basically in 3 steps. You go from values to norms, and then from norms to design requirements. So let's suppose that you have been asked to design a chicken coop, and that you want that chicken coop to be supportive of animal welfare. So your value is animal welfare. Now, how to translate that into a design? How can you do that in a systematic way? Well, the idea is that you first derive from that value a small set of norms, which are more specific requirements that you want to realize. For example, animal welfare should mean that there's enough living space for the chickens. There should be a presence of laying nests so that they can lay eggs. There should be a way for them to litter, or a litter box. There should be perches for them. Now, and then the next step is to actually translate those norms into design requirements. That's what designers are good at, and that would be the next step. So what does enough living space mean? Well, you can use some scientific research on that, and then you can come to specific design requirements, like the number of square centimeter floor area per hen, the feeding throws, the floor slope, etc. All these kinds of requirements then get very specific. So that's also what we want to do with values like privacy, like autonomy, like fairness, in the context of development of AI and big data systems. So let's move to the next question then. Which values and principles should our AI ethics by design approach be based on? Well, in the last year, 2019, we've actually seen a large number of guidelines for AI being proposed. There has been the proposal by the high-level expert group on AI of the European Commission. They have proposed ethical guidelines for AI. The OECD has made a proposal. The IEEE has made a proposal as well. Several nation states have made proposals, China, for example, and others. So 2019 is this watershed year with all these proposals for ethical guidelines, which also raises the question, well, now we have all these different ethical guidelines, which ones to pick? Fortunately, our SIENNA research has shown that these guidelines strongly converge. So luckily, they all repeatedly refer to the same underlying values like autonomy, freedom, dignity, privacy, fairness, accountability, and transparency. So luckily, the underlying values are often the same, even if the specific principles may look a little different. So for practical purposes, because this is a European Union funded project, of course, SIENNA, we take as our point of departure the European Union guidelines for ethical AI, which contain 7 requirements. So that those are that AI should be supportive of human agency and oversight, of technical robustness and safety, of privacy and data governance, transparency, of diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, of environmental and societal well-being, and of accountability. So those 7 requirements are our starting point. So we next move to the structure of the design process. So what does a design process for AI or big data systems look like? Well, we've considered a number of approaches for this and come to this kind of recurrent pattern in them, which is that you start in some way with specifying the objectives of your design. What should it be able to do? What is it for? You then go on to specify requirements. So under what constraints do you want to do this? Requirements can be cost, they can be having to do with the resources that are available. So there are additional constraints or requirements next to your objectives. So you want to specify those. Then you come to some kind of high-level design, a high-level architecture that meets your requirements and objectives. Sometimes this is preceded by the development of a conceptual model, but it's some kind of architecture that you then end up with for your system. Depending on how data intensive that system is, a next phase may be data collection and preparation, or that could also happen at a later stage. Then you get to your detailed design and development, which will involve detailed programming and coding, or if you're building a hardware system like a robot, it could also involve manufacturing. And finally, you get testing and evaluation. So this is kind of a generic description of a design process in AI, big data, and software engineering in general. So our approach then is to actually look at each of these phases of the design process and ask, where does ethics come in and how should it come in? So we look at it both at this generic level of this general structure of a design process. We have also done this for very specific, more popular approaches for the development of AI, big data, and robotic systems. For example, the CRISP-DM is a very influential approach, which is a very systematic approach to system development. We've looked at Agile, which is nowadays very popular, which is a more incremental and flexible approach for software design. And we've looked at the V methodology, which is very popular in robotics especially. So next to the more generic approach, we've also considered these specific approaches and then indicated how ethical considerations might be included. So let's go looking at the more generic steps. Let's take a look at how ethics then comes into those steps. How can we incorporate, or how can designers incorporate ethical considerations in these different phases? And keep in mind, these might be iterative phases. There may be phases that even work in parallel, but we've kind of assume that they're separate phases. So normally you would start with specifying the objectives of your system. What do you want it to be able to do? What is it for? And what we propose is a first requirement that those objectives themselves are ethically assessed, right? Because those objectives themselves may be morally problematic. So those should be evaluated against the set of ethics requirements of the European Commission, of the high-level expert group on AI, and also against more detailed ethics requirements that may apply to particular types of systems or applications. So, for example, suppose the idea is that we want to design a system that aims to manipulate people's emotional states, or a system that collects personal information inside homes without people's consent, or say a robot that can detain people without their consent. And of course, those kinds of systems raise moral issues, and we have to carefully assess whether their objectives are in fact compatible with these ethics requirements. And if the conclusions are that they are not, then the system shouldn't be developed with those objectives. The objectives should basically be changed. So next step is then that if the objectives get clearance, is to look at the requirements phase, where the requirements, the resources, more specific requirements surrounding the objectives and additional constraints are formulated. Also, those should be tested against your ethics requirements. So say, for example, at this point, you already know that your resources are involve deep learning techniques. And at the same time, you know that transparency and accountability are going to be important values that you want to uphold in your system. Now, we know that deep learning techniques are not very well compatible with transparency and accountability, because the developers often don't know what the system does and why it does what it does, right? So maybe then you need a different kind of learning technique in order to achieve those values of transparency and accountability. Also, at this point, you may want to do an ethical risk assessment or ethical impact assessment to get a better understanding of the possible ethical risks that may ensue with the system. So next, then, you go to high-level design, where you develop a high-level design architecture, as one does. And here you also want to ethically assess that particular high-level design, because new ethical issues may come forward. The particular design may not be maximally supportive of values like transparency, autonomy, privacy, and fairness. This is something we think can already be determined to some extent in high-level design architecture. And we can talk more about later how that can be done. So here also there may be data collection and preparation. So that's a very elaborate process, especially the data preparation, where you get you may get to cleanse your data, you may get to reject data, you need to validate data, you need to kind of merge data into records, you may actually create new data that you kind of derive from existing data that you have already accepted. So this is a process in which many choices are made about what data to collect and how to format it, and which ones to select data pieces and which one not. And as you do so, the important ethical issues may come to the foreground, like fairness, because that data may be about different social groups. And how do you select data about them? And how do you make inferences about the types of predicates or attributes that apply to them? So fairness is a big issue here, bias, discrimination, and diversity considerations. Also privacy, of course, if you're talking about personal data, and data quality would have to be carefully assessed. So then we get to detailed design and development, where we also again advocate an ethical assessment of the detailed design that is being proposed, where you want also an emphasis on considerations of transparency, autonomy, privacy, and fairness, because we think those values are particularly important at that stage. And finally, we have the testing and evaluation phase, in which you look at your completed system and do an ethical assessment of whether it actually meets the outcomes that you need, and whether it meets the ethical requirements. Finally, stakeholder engagement is something that we recommend, especially at the phases of the specification of objectives and requirements, as well as at the testing and evaluation phase. So this may still be somewhat general, what I'm saying here, but of course the devil is in the details. So these are quite general requirements that we are specifying. We then also have over 100 more detailed requirements within the different phases that are far more specific about what they prescribe to being done. So, for example, at the high-level design phase, we want designers to undertake a bias assessment in modeling, where they do a careful assessment of potential biases at the modeling stage, just as we have also at these different stages of data collection and preparation, or at a later stage of detailed design. So we have very specific, more detailed requirements then that developers can consult and implement for the different phases in relation to particular moral values and considerations. And we also include special topics, by which we mean that we don't only employ these general principles like fairness and privacy and others. We also say, well, there are specific ethical issues related to specific types of systems and applications, and those should also be considered. So, for example, if you're building ethically aware AI, we have specific requirements that relate to the building of such systems, or if it's fully autonomous AI, or if it involves effective computing, or if it's medical applications. And then we have a few more as well. Covert and deceptive AI, we have specific requirements, or human-like AI. So in this way, we have a very detailed framework for developers to use. At least that's what we now have in initial version. So what are our next steps? Well, we still need to work on developing this for different professional actors, for different people in the design process, to make kind of dedicated versions for them. We need further testing of our approach, so we need feedback from stakeholders, especially from developers. Third point here is the complexity issue. So, as I said, we have over 100 detailed requirements for these different design phases. So that means that we have quite a hefty document that's not going to be easy to use for developers. So we've been asked, well, can't you make it simpler? Sure, we can make it simpler. We can make it very simple. But the simpler you make it, the more superficial it becomes as well. The less guidance you actually are able to give. So it's just at the most simplest would just simply be to say to the designers, be ethical, right? That's almost like not giving any guidance at all. So as you present a simpler model, it also becomes a less helpful model, ironically. At the same time, we don't want to scare people away with 50-page documents. So what to do with that? Well, we think training and education is very important. So this is really new design methodology. So, since many of us now consider this important, it should be part of the training and the educational process. So that's why we're also developing with the Sherpa project together a training module for ethics by design. We're also working towards implementation of this in the Horizon Europe ethics review process for AI specifically. There's going to be an expected 9 billion euros program in Horizon Europe for AI research. And they want a special approach for ethics review for AI that includes ethics by design. And we're providing that for the European Commission. And we're also looking forward to work with other organizations to implement ethics by design for their organization. Thank you very much. That was